That VIP seat was merely the spark. What truly burned at the gala was a powerful couple's illusion that they could humiliate anyone without paying a price. They assumed I was just a modestly dressed woman at the wrong table. They had no idea I was the only thing standing between their company and $2.9 billion. By the time they realized their mistake, the future of their entire empire was already gone. I am Addison Bishop. I am 35 years old, and tonight I am wearing a charcoal silk dress and keeping my profile deliberately low. The grand ballroom of the Dallas Hotel is a cathedral of glass and forced laughter, hosting a tech infrastructure fundraising gala that smells overwhelmingly of roasted tenderloin and desperate networking. I stand near the edge of the room, holding a glass of sparkling water, letting the ambient noise wash over me. My dress is deliberately modest. It features a high neckline, tailored lines, and is completely devoid of any recognizable designer hardware. I wear no statement jewelry, only a simple watch. I came alone. There is no entourage trailing behind me, no assistants carrying my briefcase, and no public relations handlers whispering names into my ear. This is entirely by design. I want to see how the executive leadership of Peregrine Volt Systems behaves when they believe no one of consequence is watching. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit boardrooms of New York, they are perfectly polished. But out here in the wild, fueled by champagne and the intoxicating scent of their own impending wealth, the mask tends to slip. As the Senior Director of Capital Governance at Ashcroft Meridian Partners, I am the final gatekeeper. My pen stroke is the only thing required to authorize the opening disbursement of a $2.9 billion acquisition and partnership deal between my fund and their company. They know the name Ashcroft Meridian. They know the name A, Bishop from the endless email chains and the final signature lines, but very few of them know my face. I prefer it that way. The string quartet in the corner finishes a hollow rendition of a pop song, signaling that dinner is about to commence. I pull out my phone and pull up my secure digital invitation. It contains a uniquely generated routing code that bypasses the general reception lines. I walk past the chaotic seating charts near the entrance and move deliberately toward the center of the room, where the light from the massive crystal chandeliers hits the tables with a blinding intensity. I find the primary VIP table. It is positioned directly beneath the spotlight, right in front of the stage. The arrangement is precise. I walk around the heavy velvet-backed chairs until I find seat number 4, right there. Resting against the gold-rimmed charger plate is a heavy cardstock name tent, embossed in black ink, Bishop. It is positioned immediately to the left of the seat reserved for Graham Kincaid, the Chief Executive Officer of Peregrine Volt. The seating arrangement is purely functional. Immediately following his grand speech announcing our partnership tonight, he is scheduled to sit down, and I am scheduled to hand him the final executed addendum. I pull out the chair, smooth the skirt of my dress, and sit. I place my small clutch on the table next to my water glass. Inside that clutch is a heavy fountain pen and the authorization document. I have barely had time to take a sip of water when the atmosphere shifts. It is a subtle change in the air pressure, accompanied by the clinking of heavy diamond bracelets and the overpowering scent of a bespoke floral perfume. Vivian Kincaid has arrived. The wife of the Chief Executive Officer descends upon the table like a monarch returning to her throne. She is flanked by 3 other women, a Greek chorus of high society charity board members, all wearing varying shades of metallic gowns and identically practiced smiles. Vivian herself is striking, wrapped in emerald green satin, her hair meticulously styled to look effortlessly windswept. She stops abruptly. Her eyes lock onto me. The practiced smile vanishes, replaced instantly by a sharp, calculating glare. She looks at my unbranded charcoal dress, my bare neck, my simple hairstyle. I can see the mental arithmetic happening behind her eyes. In less than 2 seconds, she has processed my net worth, my social standing, and my usefulness to her. She has graded me as a 0. She has concluded that I am a nobody who has wandered into the wrong enclosure. Vivian leans forward slightly. Her voice, when she speaks, is perfectly modulated. It is sweet, melodic, and entirely toxic. "Excuse me," Vivian says, her tone loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding guests. "I believe you have wandered into the wrong section, dear." I look up at her, keeping my expression entirely neutral. "I assure you, I am in the correct seat." Vivian lets out a short, breathy laugh that lacks any real amusement. She glances back at her friends, rolling her eyes as if sharing a joke with them. "This is the executive center table," she says, turning her attention back to me. "This specific seating area is strictly reserved for people who are truly important to the company and its future. There are overflow tables near the back doors. I'm sure someone there can help you find your actual place." It is a public execution, performed with a smile. She is not just asking me to move, she is establishing her territory and demonstrating her power to banish anyone she deems unworthy. "I checked my secure code before sitting down," I say, my voice steady, betraying no emotion. I gesture subtly toward the heavy cardstock resting beside my plate. "My name is right here." Vivian does not even lower her gaze to look at the card. The physical evidence of my right to be there is irrelevant to her. What matters is her perception of the hierarchy. "I do not care what that piece of paper says," she snaps, the honey dropping entirely from her voice. There has obviously been a clerical error. "Someone like you does not belong at this table. You are making the other guests uncomfortable. Now, I suggest you stand up and leave before this becomes an embarrassment for you." An interesting thing happens then. A sudden cold clarity washes over me. I do not feel anger. I feel the quiet thrill of a hunter watching the prey step willingly into the trap. I slowly shift my gaze away from Vivian to observe the other early arrivals at the table. To my left is a prominent venture capitalist. Across from me is a partner from a major law firm. There are perhaps 6 or 7 people within earshot who possess immense wealth and corporate power. I wait for one of them to intervene. I wait for one of them to suggest that we check with the event coordinator, or perhaps simply offer a polite de-escalation. No one says a word. Instead, they watch. They lean back in their chairs, sipping their expensive champagne, their eyes fixed on the confrontation. They are not uncomfortable with Vivian's blatant cruelty. On the contrary, they are entertained. They are eagerly waiting to see the modestly dressed stranger be humiliated and discarded. It is a sport to them, a minor theatrical performance before the first course is served. Vivienne, sensing the silent support of her peers, decides to escalate. She raises her hand and snaps her fingers sharply in the direction of the perimeter. A young man wearing a headset, clearly the floor manager for the event staff, rushes over immediately. He looks terrified. "Mrs. Kincaid, how can I help you?" he stammers. Vivian points a manicured finger at me. "This woman is refusing to vacate a reserved executive seat. Remove her name card from this table immediately, and find out which idiot on your team allowed her past the velvet ropes." The floor manager turns pale. He looks at me, then down at the table. He hesitates for a fraction of a second when he sees the printed name. But the sheer force of Vivian's glare breaks his professional training. He reaches out, his hand trembling slightly, and snatches the card reading A, Bishop, right off the table. He crushes it into his palm and steps back, lowering his head in submission. The erasure is complete. With a single command, she has deleted my identity from the table. It is a fluid, practiced motion that tells me everything I need to know. This is not a momentary lapse in judgment. This is an entrenched behavioral pattern. Vivienne Kincaid is accustomed to rearranging the reality of Peregrine Volt systems to suit her personal whims, and the company machinery is trained to comply without question. "There," Vivian says, looking down at me with absolute triumph. "The mistake has been corrected. Now, leave." I remain seated and silent. I do not offer my title or reveal what is at stake. Instead, I rest my right hand lightly on the top of my clutch. The cool metal of the clasp bites into my palm. I look around the table one more time, making deliberate eye contact with the venture capitalist, the law partner, the complicit floor manager, and finally, Vivian Kincaid herself. I am memorizing their faces. I am recording every micro-expression, every smirk, every silent endorsement of this abuse of power. They think they are participating in a minor act of social gatekeeping. They have no idea that they have just walked into a governance audit, and every single one of them is failing spectacularly. The tension at the table thickens, transforming from gleeful anticipation to a heavy, suffocating awkwardness. I sit perfectly still, breathing evenly, letting the silence stretch out, waiting for them to make their next catastrophic mistake. The suffocating weight of the room begins to press inward. Vivian realizes her initial command did not produce the immediate, panicked retreat she expected. Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows twitch, just a fraction of an inch, betraying a flicker of genuine irritation beneath the glossy veneer. She does not step back. Instead, she leans closer, invading my physical space, her bespoke floral perfume now cloying and heavy in the air. She raises her voice. It is a calculated projection, designed to carry over the gentle hum of the string quartet and the clinking of heavy silverware from the adjacent tables. "This gala is an exclusive event," Vivian announces, addressing the surrounding chairs as much as she is addressing me. It is certainly not a place for low-level employees to learn how to play investor for the evening. We have strict protocols for a reason. The venture capitalist to my left shifts in his seat, a small, amused smirk playing on his lips. Across the table, a woman draped in an absurd amount of diamonds leans forward. This is Celia Broder, Vivian's closest confidant, and an enforcer in this petty social hierarchy. "Really, darling," Celia says, her voice dripping with condescension. She looks me up and down, her eyes lingering on the absence of a wedding band on my left hand. "Which law firm do you actually serve? Or are you just someone's +1 who got hopelessly lost on the way to the coat check?" I keep my hands folded quietly in my lap. I keep my title to myself. I do not mention the fund I represent, or that my signature controls the acquisition they are all here to celebrate. I want to see the absolute bottom of this well. I want to witness exactly how far this rampant abuse of power will extend when they believe I have zero institutional shield to protect me. From the corner of my eye, I catch a slow, sweeping movement. The event organizers have hired a professional media team, and one of their heavy broadcast cameras mounted on a sleek mechanical arm is panning gracefully across the ballroom floor. The glowing red tally light indicates it is actively recording. It is broadcasting a live feed to the massive screens flanking the main stage and streaming directly to the corporate landing page for thousands of shareholders to witness. The lens glides toward our table precisely as Vivian makes her next move. Dissatisfied with my continued silence, she reaches out and snatches the crumpled name card back from the paralyzed floor manager. With a sharp, aggressive slap, she flattens it face down against the crisp white tablecloth. She then wraps her manicured fingers around the stem of my crystal champagne flute and shoves it roughly toward the absolute edge of the table. The golden liquid sloshes violently, spilling a few cold drops onto the fabric. It is a physical dismissal, a blatant pantomime of eviction performed right as the high-definition camera locks onto our position. I remain completely still. The camera operator pauses the mechanical arm, sensing the unnatural tension, capturing the raw tableau of the furious executive wife towering over the silent, seated guest. Vivian's patience evaporates entirely. The polite, high society facade shatters into pieces, leaving only raw, ugly entitlement. She snaps her head toward the perimeter of the room and signals frantically. "Security," Vivian commands, her voice cracking slightly with unhinged rage. "Remove her! Right now!" This is the exact moment the invisible line is crossed. What started as an arrogant display of social dominance has instantly escalated into a forced physical coercion, and it is happening in front of dozens of direct, highly influential witnesses. A heavy-set man in a dark tailored suit steps out from the shadows near the stage curtain. He is Trent Maddox, the head of corporate security for the hosting company. He moves with the brusque authority of a man who is used to handling messy situations quietly and violently, but there is nothing quiet about this. He approaches my chair, his face a tight mask of grim determination. He does not ask me to leave. He does not offer a polite inquiry or ask to see my credentials. Trent Maddox reaches down and firmly grips my left elbow, his thick fingers digging hard into the silk of my dress. The sudden physical contact sends a jolt of ice through the surrounding crowd. Vivian stands tall, her chest heaving slightly, victorious. She looks down at me, her eyes flashing with pure venom. "If you want to be the main character tonight," she sneers, ensuring her voice carries clearly to the adjacent tables, "at least buy the right class of ticket." The atmosphere in the room changes from amused observation to predatory excitement. All around the restricted section, I see the subtle, synchronized movement of hands reaching into suit jackets and sequined evening bags. Guests are pulling out their mobile phones. Dozens of screens illuminate the dim space like tiny, harsh spotlights. They are hitting record. None of them are stepping forward to intervene. None of them are questioning the legality or the ethics of a corporate security chief laying hands on a seated guest at the direct behest of a spouse who holds no official title. They smell a massive scandal, and they want to own a piece of it. Their collective silence is no longer just awkward. It has become a frightening, active accomplice to the assault happening right in front of them. I look down at Trent Maddox's thick fingers gripping my arm. Then I look up, past him, directly into Vivian's triumphant eyes. I finally speak. My voice is very soft, barely above a whisper, yet it cuts through the ambient noise with absolute, terrifying precision. "You should take your hand off my arm," I say, my tone devoid of any fear or panic. "Before this gets extremely expensive." Vivian stares at me for a fraction of a second before letting out a sharp, dismissive laugh. It is the cold, hollow sound of someone who believes she is entirely untouchable. She thinks it is a weak, desperate threat from a humiliated woman grasping at straws. She has no concept of the financial avalanche that is currently suspended precariously above her head. "Pull her up," Vivian snaps at the security chief, dismissing my warning entirely. Trent Maddox tightens his grip and shifts his weight, planting his boots firmly into the carpet, preparing to physically haul me out of the seat. Before he can exert the necessary upward force, a sudden, chaotic commotion erupts from the direction of the main entrance hallway. Heavy footsteps pound against the floorboards. "Trent, drop your hand right now." The voice is frantic, tearing through the polite hum of the ballroom like a blaring siren. I turn my head slightly to see Elliot Voss, the head of investor relations, sprinting toward our table. He is sweating profusely, his expensive tuxedo jacket flapping wildly around him. Right on his heels, moving with equal, desperate urgency, is Mara Ellison, the company's general counsel. They crash into the circle of onlookers, gasping for air. Elliot's face is completely drained of color. He looks as though he has just witnessed a fatal car crash. Mara Ellison's eyes dart wildly around the scene. She looks at the live stream camera pointing directly at our table, then at the sea of glowing mobile phones recording the confrontation. She stares at Trent Maddox's heavy hand still gripping my elbow, and finally, her eyes lock onto the overturned name card resting next to my pushed champagne glass. Their expressions tell a story that Vivian is completely incapable of reading. The two executives are not looking at a petty social squabble. They are not looking at a minor seating misunderstanding. They are looking at the sudden, violent implosion of everything they have worked for over the past 36 months. Trent Maddox freezes instantly, deeply confused by the conflicting orders from his corporate superiors. He loosely drops his hand from my arm. stepping back as if the silk of my dress has suddenly caught fire. Vivian opens her mouth, her face twisting in indignation, preparing to demand why they are interrupting her public victory, but Elliot Voss holds up a shaking hand, silencing her before she can speak a single word. The sheer, unadulterated panic radiating from the two executives is so palpable that it sucks the remaining oxygen right out of the room. The phones keep recording. The live stream camera keeps rolling. And I remain exactly where I am, seated perfectly still in chair number 4, waiting for the devastating reality of the situation to finally crash down upon them. Release her arm right this second. The command rips out of Elliot Voss's throat, completely devoid of his usual polished investor relations cadence. It is a sound of raw, unadulterated panic. Trent Maddox recoils instantly. The corporate security chief steps backward, his thick hands shooting up to his chest, palms facing outward in a gesture of sudden surrender. He looks frantically between his direct superior and the furious woman standing across the table. Vivian's mouth opens, but no sound emerges. A deep, jagged crease forms between her perfectly sculpted eyebrows. In her tightly controlled universe, the staff always obeys her without hesitation. This sudden insubordination is a massive glitch in her reality. She looks at Elliot, expecting him to reinforce her authority, to apologize for the delay and assist in my removal. But Elliot is not looking at her. He is staring at me with the horrified expression of a man watching a lit match drop into a powder keg. Beside him, Mara Ellison ignores Vivian entirely. The general counsel's eyes are locked onto the white tablecloth. She stares at the rectangular indentation left by the heavy cardstock, then at the card itself, lying face down like a discarded playing card. Mara's gaze then snaps upward, tracing an invisible line from our seating position to the sleek black dome of the security camera mounted discreetly on the ceiling, and finally to the massive broadcasting rig still tracking our every movement from across the ballroom. I can see the exact second the legal implications detonate in her mind. Her skin turns the color of old parchment. This is not a fleeting social faux pas. It is a fully documented, time-stamped liability playing out in high definition. Before Vivian can find her voice to demand an explanation, the crowd of onlookers parts slightly. Graham Kincaid glides into the epicenter of the disaster. The chief executive officer of Peregrine Volt wears a perfectly tailored tuxedo and a warm, disarming smile. He has clearly been alerted to a disturbance on the floor, but assumes it is a trivial dispute over spilled wine, bruised egos, or perhaps an overzealous photographer. What seems to be the issue here? Graham asks smoothly, placing a proprietary, calming hand on his wife's waist. Let us not let a simple seating mix up ruin such a spectacular evening. I am sure we can find a suitable arrangement for everyone involved. He looks down at me, offering a practiced, condescending apology meant to pacify a subordinate or a confused vendor. Elliot steps directly between his billionaire boss and my chair. He does not whisper. He speaks with the terrifying clarity of a surgeon delivering a terminal diagnosis. Graham, Elliot says, his voice vibrating with a tension that makes the crystal glasses on the table rattle. This is Addison Bishop. She is the Senior Director of Capital Governance for Ashcroft Meridian Partners. She is the person holding the final approval to unlock our $2.9 billion disbursement. The silence that follows is absolute. It is a physical entity, heavy and suffocating, dropping over the restricted executive section like a lead blanket. The gentle hum of the string quartet in the background suddenly sounds absurdly loud. The transformation of the surrounding audience is instantaneous and brutal. The venture capitalist to my left, who had been smirking just moments ago, suddenly finds the geometric pattern of the carpet utterly fascinating. Celia Broder, who had loudly questioned my employment status, physically shrinks back into her chair, the blood draining from her face so fast she looks ill. The glowing mobile phones that were eagerly recording the scandal are slowly, sheepishly lowered into laps and sequined evening bags. The people who were laughing and waiting for my humiliation are now desperately avoiding eye contact with me, terrified that I might remember their faces when the financial slaughter begins tomorrow morning. Vivian stands completely frozen. Her hand, previously resting triumphantly on her hip, drops limply to her side. She stares at me, her eyes wide, struggling desperately to process the information. She understands the number, 2.9 billion, but her brain, wired for decades of unchecked privilege and sycophancy, cannot reconcile that massive sum with the quiet, unassuming woman she just tried to physically throw out of the room. She is stunned, trapped in a state of cognitive dissonance. Yet the true, apocalyptic magnitude of the catastrophe has not fully breached her defenses. She still thinks this might just be an embarrassing social error she will have to fake her way through with a forced apology and a gift basket later. Graham's survival instincts kick in. The warm, patronizing smile vanishes instantly, replaced by a mask of rigorous, desperate crisis management. He realizes immediately that the ballroom floor, surrounded by hundreds of peering eyes, rival investors, and active microphones, is a highly toxic environment. "Ms. Bishop," Graham says, his tone dropping an octave, projecting deep gravity and sudden deference. "Please accept my most profound apologies for this inexcusable confusion. If you would be so kind, there is a private executive lounge just down the hall. I would consider it a tremendous personal favor if we could step inside to clarify this misunderstanding away from the noise of the main floor." He is trying to reclaim control of the narrative. He wants to contain the blast radius before the shockwave hits the financial press. I do not nod. I simply pick up my clutch from the table and stand. The walk through the ballroom is an excruciating march. The sea of wealthy guests parts for us, completely silent, their eyes tracking our procession. Graham leads the way, his posture rigid. He is followed closely by a hyperventilating Elliot, a visibly shaken Mara, and a silent chief financial officer, Dean Holloway, who materialized from the crowd just as my title was announced. Vivian trails behind them, her steps stiff, her eyes darting nervously as she finally registers the cold stares of her peers. The heavy oak doors of the private hotel lounge close behind us with a solid, echoing thud. The sudden absence of the ballroom chatter makes the room feel like a sensory deprivation chamber. The space smells faintly of expensive leather and stale cigars. There is a long mahogany conference table in the center of the room. I walk to the head of the table and take a seat. I do not invite anyone else to sit down. They stand before me like defendants waiting for a verdict to be read. I do not raise my voice. I do not display a single ounce of anger, indignation, or humiliation. I simply look at the general counsel. "I have exactly 3 questions," I state, my voice perfectly level, stripping all emotion from the room. "First, is the event out there currently being live-streamed to the public? Second, do the overhead security cameras retain their footage on a secure corporate server? And third, did the security directive to physically remove me originate from an individual who holds absolutely no official executive role within this corporation?" Mara Ellison swallows hard. The sound is audible in the quiet room. She does not need to answer me. The terror in her eyes provides all the confirmation I require. At the far end of the table, Dean Holloway drops his heavy leather briefcase onto a side chair. His hands are shaking violently as he snaps the brass locks open. He pulls out a massive, 2-inch thick binder containing the finalized acquisition contracts. He flips frantically through the dense legal pages, the sound of tearing paper echoing sharply. He stops roughly 3/4 of the way through the binder, his trembling finger tracing a specific, densely worded paragraph. "Oh God," Dean whispers. The chief financial officer looks up, his face entirely ashen. Graham steps closer, his polished composure finally cracking. "What is it?" "Dean, talk to me right now." "It is a clause in the secondary governance appendix," Dean says, his voice breaking. "A section almost everyone skips over during the final legal review. The executive conduct and influence trigger. Read it, I command quietly. Dean clears his throat, but his voice remains thin and panicked. It stipulates that the investing entity retains the absolute right to unilaterally halt all scheduled capital disbursements if the public behavior of any person exerting significant influence over the company exposes material governance risks or structural liabilities. Graham turns sharply toward his general counsel, desperation bleeding into his voice. Mara can. They actually enforce a multi-billion-dollar termination based on a seating dispute. Mara looks directly at her boss, abandoning any pretense of corporate loyalty. She is a lawyer protecting her own professional license now. It does not require them to prove malice, Graham, Mara explains, her words dropping like heavy stones onto the mahogany table. The clause only requires a documented behavior, a behavior with a clear, demonstrable link to the operational power structure of the company, a behavior that possesses the potential to negatively impact the reputation and stability of the commercial agreement. She has the live stream footage. She has the security logs. She has dozens of witnesses. The trigger is entirely valid. The room descends into a profound, suffocating silence. The cold reality of the situation settles over the executives like winter frost. The $2.9 billion lifeline they spent years negotiating, the capital meant to secure their legacy, is currently resting entirely on the edge of a knife. And the person holding the handle of that knife is the woman they just tried to violently erase from their presence. I slowly lean forward. I place my hands flat on the polished wood of the table. I look past the terrified lawyers, past the hyperventilating financial officer, and directly into the eyes of the chief executive officer. This was never about a seat, I say, the words slicing through the heavy air with surgical precision. I just witnessed exactly how this company distributes its power outside of the official organizational chart. The mahogany room is silent, heavy with the realization of what has just transpired. But my mind is completely detached from the panic radiating across the table. Instead, I find myself grounded in a reality far removed from the plush carpets of this Dallas hotel. I'm thinking about Pittsburgh. I grew up in the shadow of steel mills that had long since stopped burning. In a neighborhood where the air always tasted faintly of rust and exhausted possibilities. My father was an industrial electrician. He spent 30 years pulling thick, heavy voltage cables through the suffocating, grease-stained guts of manufacturing plants. He came home every night with hands calloused into rough leather and shoulders permanently stooped from carrying the literal weight of the city's power grid. My mother was a bookkeeper for a small, perpetually struggling auto parts distributor. She spent her evenings at our scuffed kitchen table, illuminated by a single harsh bulb, fighting brutal battles over margins of a few pennies, ensuring the ledger balanced so the delivery drivers could get their paychecks on Friday. From them, I learned the fundamental architecture of the world. I learned that the executives standing on the polished stages do not keep the lights on. They do not keep the machines running. The quiet people, the invisible workers who turn the wrenches, audit the daily receipts, and absorb the friction of the daily grind, are the only reason the entire system does not collapse into catastrophic ruin. You respect the quiet people. You respect the unseen structure. That philosophy did not soften when I entered the ruthless arena of corporate finance. It hardened into a weapon. Before I was recruited by Ashcroft Meridian Partners, I spent 5 grueling years working in risk management for a massive manufacturing conglomerate headquartered in Ohio. During my 3rd year, I watched a $500 million merger completely disintegrate within the span of 72 hours. The failure was not caused by a sudden economic downturn, a flawed financial projection, or an unpredictable shift in global tariffs. It imploded because the executive leadership suite willfully ignored a series of tiny, seemingly insignificant ethical red flags on the factory floor. They turned a blind eye to supervisors cutting corners on safety protocols to save 10 minutes on a shift. They promoted managers who bullied the quality assurance inspectors. They believed their sheer arrogance and market dominance could indefinitely outpace the consequences of their toxic culture. They were spectacularly wrong. The entire foundation rotted from the inside out, and when the pressure of the merger was applied, the company shattered. I walked away from that wreckage with a cemented reputation. The financial sector quickly learned that Addison Bishop is entirely immune to the theater of wealth. I do not care about the glowing green numbers racing across the stock exchange ticker. I am completely unmoved by rehearsed keynote speeches delivered in grand ballrooms. Glowing profiles in prestigious business magazines mean absolutely nothing to me. Pyramids of expensive champagne and meticulously catered galas do not make my hand tremble when it is time to freeze a wire transfer. I evaluate the structural integrity of the people running the machine, not the paint job on the exterior. This core belief dictates everything about my professional existence, right down to my wardrobe. It is the exact reason I deliberately wear minimalist, unbranded clothing. It is the reason I leave my heavy, embossed corporate business cards locked in my desk drawer when I attend these functions. When you strip away the protective armor of a formidable job title and the recognizable markers of high net worth, you become a human mirror. Powerful people look at a plain dress, an unadorned neck, and a quiet demeanor, and they immediately drop their guard. They stop performing. They show you their true reflexes. They reveal the exact, unfiltered truth of who they are when they believe the person standing in front of them does not matter, cannot help them, and cannot hurt them. It is the most effective diagnostic tool in my arsenal. And that brings me to the woman standing outside this room, Vivian Kincaid. When she descended upon table number 4 tonight, it was not the first time her name had crossed my radar. During the grueling 8-month due diligence phase of this monumental acquisition, I personally combed through thousands of pages of internal communications, operational logs, and vendor agreements. Buried deep within the mundane footnotes of logistical emails, I found whispers. There were vague, carefully worded complaints from mid-level logistics managers regarding the chief executive officer's wife, making unapproved unilateral changes to catering and venue contracts. There were hushed, nervous email threads between the investor relations team about her aggressively dictating the guest lists for highly sensitive shareholder outreach seminars. There were subtle indications that she was leveraging her marital status to bypass standard compliance protocols. None of these isolated incidents constituted a hard, legally binding breach of fiduciary duty at the time. They were merely shadows on the wall, but in my line of work, small warning signs eventually become impossible to ignore. I marked every single one of those anomalies with a thick red pen. They pointed to a terrifying systemic reality. The boundary between the spouse of the executive and the actual operational center of power at Peregrine Volt Systems was dangerously porous. It suggested a shadow government operating entirely outside the purview of the board of directors. I did not fly halfway across the country to Dallas tonight to eat a catered dinner. I did not come to politely accept their hollow gratitude or to be feted as a conquering hero of finance. I came to inspect the final coat of polish on a very expensive machine before I authorized the irreversible release of the first massive tranche of capital. I needed to see, with my own eyes, if those terrifying shadows I found in the paperwork possessed a physical, undeniable form. Therefore, the sickening spectacle that just unfolded around that VIP seat was never about a personal insult. My ego is not tied to a piece of heavily embossed cardstock. I do not require validation from strangers wrapped in satin. For me, the public humiliation Vivian attempted to violently inflict was a blinding, unavoidable searchlight illuminating my exact worst-case scenario. Peregrine Volt Systems possesses a pristine, mathematically perfect corporate governance structure on paper. They have the right committees, the right diversity quotas, and the right compliance officers. But tonight proved that the paper is a lie. In reality, this multi-billion-dollar entity operates on a toxic, unregulated currency of unchecked ego, terrified compliance, and shadowy, backstage dictates. It is a company where a person with absolutely zero legal authority can snap her fingers and force the chief of corporate security to lay hands on a silent guest. I look back at the men sitting around the mahogany table. Their expensive suits look suddenly too large for them. They are waiting for me to scream, to demand a public apology, to ask for someone to be fired. They do not understand that the anger they expect is a luxury I discarded years ago. As the silence stretches into its second agonizing minute, I hear my father's voice echoing over the low, steady hum of the hotel air conditioning. I see him wiping the heavy, dark grease from his cracked hands with a shop towel at our kitchen table, leaning forward to tell me the truest thing I have ever known. "Addison," he would say, his voice rough but incredibly gentle. "If someone treats another person poorly, simply because they think that person is unimportant, the problem is not about a lack of politeness. It is about a lack of humanity. It is about their fundamental nature. And nature, my girl, never changes just because the stakes get higher." I left the mahogany room without offering them a single word of comfort. The heavy door clicked into its frame behind me, securely sealing their panic inside. I walked straight to the private elevators, bypassing the glittering remnants of the Gala entirely, and rode up to my hotel suite. The night was no longer mine to control. The structural infection had finally been exposed to the open air, and my only remaining task was to sit back and observe the fever spike. The moment I entered my room, I discarded my clutch on the desk, opened my encrypted laptop, and initiated a secure communication link with Russell Dane. As the senior managing partner at Ashcroft Meridian in New York, Russell was the only person above me in the approval chain. He appeared on the screen wearing a dark suit, sitting in his office despite the late hour. "Walk me through the detonation," Russell said, his voice clipped and highly analytical. I delivered the sequence of events with absolute clinical precision. I stripped away every ounce of personal grievance. I detailed the seating arrangement, the public dismissal, the physical coercion by corporate security, and the immediate panic of their legal counsel. Russell absorbed the information without a single change in his facial expression. He operates purely on the metrics of risk and exposure. "I need you to draft a comprehensive, completely neutral incident report," Russell instructed, leaning forward into the camera frame. "Ensure it is entirely devoid of emotional language. We are not making a decision based on a perceived social slight or a damaged ego. Ashcroft Meridian does not withdraw a $2.9 billion commitment because an executive spouse was rude to you. We pull the funding because the target company has just demonstrated a catastrophic failure in their governance architecture. Document the structural risk. Let them collapse under the weight of their own operational failures." While I sat in the quiet isolation of my suite, drafting the memorandum that would likely bring their empire to an end, the fallout was already ripping through Peregrine Volt systems from within. I did not need to be in the room to know exactly how their nightmare was unfolding. The corporate crisis playbook is always the same, and the resulting chaos is entirely predictable. Just 3 floors below me, Graham Kincaid had immediately summoned an emergency, off-cycle remote session with his entire board of directors. The digital feeds were undoubtedly filled with angry, terrified faces logging in from across the country. Simultaneously, Dean Holloway was locked in a separate room, sweating profusely over the syndicate agreements. Our $2.9 billion injection was the foundational anchor of the entire acquisition. Every other financial institution involved had based their participation entirely on Ashcroft Meridian's presence. The secondary banks viewed our rigorous due diligence as their ultimate safety net. Now, that net was actively unraveling. Dean's mobile phone was undoubtedly vibrating off the table. The syndicate partners were already sending frantic messages, demanding immediate updates. They wanted to know if the deal was remaining intact, or if a specific event had just occurred that would activate their own unilateral withdrawal clauses. They could smell the smoke, and they were sprinting for the exits. But the most devastating blow of the night did not come from the banks. It came from their own legal department. Mara Ellison had sequestered herself in a temporary office down the hall from the boardroom. She had successfully demanded the raw, unedited footage from the broadcasting team hired for the gala. She sat in the dark, watching the high-definition recording over and over again. As a seasoned corporate attorney, she was looking for a viable defense strategy. Instead, she found the exact opposite. Mara realized that the visual evidence was far worse than she had initially anticipated. Vivian Kincaid had not merely acted like a belligerent socialite. The camera clearly captured Vivian issuing direct, highly specific operational commands to the event staff and the chief of security. She was pointing fingers, dictating the removal of authorized personnel, and commanding company resources with the absolute authority of a de facto chief operating officer. The footage proved that the staff did not hesitate. They followed her illegal orders seamlessly, indicating this was a deeply ingrained chain of command. Up on the emergency board call, the directors were plunging into a vicious civil war. The internal factions were tearing at each other. The board members, fiercely loyal to Graham, wanted to treat the entire disaster as a massive public relations failure. They proposed drafting a heavily sanitized press release, framing it as a highly regrettable misunderstanding, and issuing a swift public apology to contain the narrative. The opposing faction, however, saw the lethal trap hidden beneath that strategy. If the company officially apologized for Vivian's actions, they would be legally acknowledging that she possessed the capacity to act on behalf of the corporation. They would be admitting that the chief executive officer's wife held undocumented, unregulated influence over company operations. It was a legal paradox they could not survive. The arguments grew louder, but Elliot Voss abruptly silenced the entire board with a single, terrifying piece of intelligence. "The narrative is already gone," Elliot announced, his voice echoing through the conference speakers. He revealed that several key guests seated in the immediate vicinity of the confrontation were actual representatives of the very same auxiliary investment funds Dean Holloway was trying to pacify. Those representatives had quietly slipped out of the ballroom doors the exact moment the security chief grabbed my arm. They had witnessed the systemic failure firsthand. The rumors were already burning through the private financial channels, moving infinitely faster than any corporate press release could hope to travel. The walls were rapidly closing in on them. At exactly 11:45, my mobile phone lit up on the desk next to my laptop. The caller identification displayed Graham Kincaid's private number. I let it ring 3 times before sliding my finger across the screen to accept the connection. "Ms. Bishop," Graham said. His voice was completely stripped of its former arrogant polish. He sounded hollowed out, entirely exhausted by the last 3 hours of brutal reality. "I am asking you for a brief window of time. Give us 48 hours before you file your formal recommendation to your investment committee. Let me fix this. Let me correct the perception of what happened tonight." I looked out the window of my suite, staring at the endless streams of headlights moving along the Dallas highways in the dark. "Perception is not the problem here, Graham," I replied, my tone maintaining the required emotional neutrality. "The undeniable recorded evidence is the problem. You cannot correct a structural rot by simply changing the lighting in the room." I terminated the call without waiting for a rebuttal. Downstairs, as the emergency board meeting dragged on in a state of paralyzing indecision, Mara Ellison received a notification on her personal device. It was a text message sent through an encrypted application, originating from an anonymous, untraceable number. Given the extreme security protocols of the board, she knew immediately it had to be from one of the directors currently sitting on the active video call. Mara opened the message. It contained a single, chilling sentence. "If you are looking at tonight and thinking this is a brand new problem, then you have not been paying enough attention to this company." That single message changed the entire trajectory of the night for the legal team. It was the confirmation of every shadow I had tracked during the due diligence process. As the clock pushed past 2 in the morning, nobody inside the executive ranks of Peregrine Volt Systems was talking about the empty chair at table number 4 anymore. The initial shock of the social insult had completely evaporated. It had been replaced by a much larger, infinitely more terrifying question that threatened to consume them all. If an individual who holds absolutely no official title, no fiduciary duty, and no legal accountability can casually command company security in front of the world's most powerful investors, then how many other critical, multi-million-dollar decisions have already been secretly compromised by that exact same invisible hand? The foundation was cracking, and the collapse was now inevitable. The sun had not yet breached the Dallas skyline when my encrypted laptop chimed with a priority notification. It was exactly 5:15 in the morning. Hours before the New York markets would open and the financial world would begin to react to the whispers bleeding out from the Gala. I sat at the glass desk in my hotel suite, a cup of untouched black coffee growing cold beside my hand. I opened my secure inbox. Sitting at the very top of the queue was an email from a heavily masked, anonymous routing address. The sender had bypassed several standard corporate firewalls to reach me directly. There was no body text in the message. There was no greeting and no signature. The subject line contained only 4 words. She always does this. Attached to the phantom email was a single, densely compressed data file. In my profession, anonymous tips are a daily hazard. They are usually the desperate, fabricated pleas of disgruntled former employees or the clumsy sabotage attempts of rival firms. You never trust them implicitly, but you never ignore them, either. I ran the file through Ashcroft Meridian's primary threat detection protocol. When the system returned a clean scan, I extracted the contents. My screen instantly populated with dozens of high-resolution images, formatted documents, and exported communication logs. It was a meticulously curated digital graveyard of Peregrine Volt Systems' internal operations over the past 36 months. I leaned closer to the monitor, the harsh blue light reflecting off my eyes. I began to open the files one by one, peeling back the polished exterior of the company to expose the rot underneath. The first cluster of documents contained internal email screenshots and vendor invoices related to high-level corporate functions. I cross-referenced the dates and event names. These were not charity dinners or holiday parties. These were crucial strategic negotiation summits, investor relation retreats, and closed-door product demonstrations. The emails revealed a horrifying pattern. Vivienne Kincaid, operating entirely outside the official corporate hierarchy, was routinely intercepting the guest lists and seating charts for these critical events. She was not offering suggestions. She was issuing mandates. I read threads where she unilaterally struck the names of essential supply chain partners from invite lists simply because she found them personally abrasive. In other instances, she forcefully inserted her own preferred social contacts, people with absolutely no relevance to the tech infrastructure sector, into highly sensitive negotiation tables. I opened another folder labeled strictly with the name of the security chief. Here, the true depth of the shadow governance was laid bare. There was an exported chain of encrypted text messages between Trent Maddox and a private administrative assistant who worked exclusively for the Kincaid family office, an entity legally separate from the publicly traded corporation. The messages spanned 2 years. They proved conclusively that during public corporate appearances, the head of Peregrine Volt's security apparatus did not receive his primary instructions from the Corporate Event Operations Center. He received real-time, direct orders from Vivienne through her personal staff. He was acting as her private enforcer, utilizing company payroll and corporate authority to police her personal social borders. I did not immediately accept this treasure trove of corporate treason as absolute fact. Evidence that arrives perfectly packaged in the middle of the night requires brutal, unforgiving scrutiny. At 6:10 in the morning, I initiated a secure video conference with the head of digital forensics at Ashcroft Meridian in New York. I just forwarded a data packet to your secure server. I told him the moment his tired face appeared on my screen, I need an immediate microscopic authentication. Strip the metadata, trace the routing pathways, cross-reference the event dates in these screenshots with the publicly filed corporate calendars. Verify the invoice numbers against the general ledger we hold in the due diligence vault. I need to know if this data is manufactured or if it is real. Give me exactly 90 minutes, he replied, already typing furiously on his end. I spent that hour and a half pacing the length of my suite, turning the implications over in my mind. If these documents were authentic, the entire paradigm of the crisis shifted violently. The abhorrent display at the VIP table was no longer a spontaneous, isolated outburst of arrogance. It was the physical manifestation of an entrenched, long-standing, unofficial power model. It meant the chief executive officer had surrendered operational control of his own company's borders to an unelected, unvetted individual who carried zero fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders. At 7:45, my laptop chimed again. The forensics director reappeared. "The preliminary results are solid," he reported, his tone deadpan and serious. "The metadata on the screenshots aligns perfectly with the server timestamps. The email headers match the internal routing architecture of their corporate network. The billing codes on the catering and venue invoices match the exact alphanumeric sequences in the ledgers they provided to us last month. The probability of this being a fabricated dossier is virtually zero. You have a massive governance breach on your hands." I thanked him and closed the connection. I returned to the files, my eyes scanning the remaining documents with renewed intensity. Deep within a subfolder containing communications from over a year ago, I found an email that forced the breath from my lungs. It was a message from Vivian to the former head of investor relations, demanding the removal of a prominent female founder of a Midwestern logistics firm from an intimate strategic dinner. Vivian's written justification was stark, cruel, and entirely devoid of any business logic. "Take her off the list," the email read. "She dresses like a regional sales manager. She does not look like someone who brings money into the room." The phrasing was a chilling echo of the contempt I had personally absorbed just a few hours prior. The prejudice was systematic. The arrogance was institutionalized. My phone rang. It was Russell Dane, calling from his office in Manhattan. "I received your incident report," Russell said immediately, "and I just reviewed the forensic authentication of the anonymous data drop you forwarded. This completely alters our position. Addison." "It does," I agreed quietly. "If these internal records hold up under a formal legal challenge, we are no longer looking at a simple case of poor executive leadership or a toxic corporate culture," Russell stated, his voice devoid of all warmth. "This is a profound governance deviation. If a spouse can dictate who sits at a negotiation table and command corporate security to enforce her personal biases, it distorts the entire decision-making process of the firm. It means their board of directors is either entirely complicit or completely blind. Neither scenario is an acceptable risk for a $2.9 billion capital injection." As I disconnected the call with Russell, the screen of my mobile phone lit up with an incoming call from Graham Kincaid. It was his fourth attempt since dawn. I finally answered. "Addison," Graham said, his voice ragged, betraying a sleepless night of profound panic. "Please, I am begging you, let us meet before the markets open. Just the two of us. We can grab a coffee in the lobby. We can find a way to compromise on this. I can offer you personal guarantees." His desperation was pathetic, entirely disconnected from the gravity of the situation. He still thought he could charm his way out of a structural collapse with a quiet, off-the-record conversation. "I will not meet you for coffee, Graham," I replied, my voice as hard and cold as polished granite. "And there will be no private compromises. If you wish to speak with me, you will arrange a formal conference room, you will bring your general counsel, and I will have Ashcroft's legal team present on a secure line. Furthermore, there will be a certified stenographer present to create an official binding transcript of every word spoken. If you agree to those exact terms, I will see you at 9 o'clock. If not, my final recommendation goes to the investment committee in exactly 2 hours." There was a long, agonizing pause on the other end of the line. The heavy silence was the sound of a powerful man realizing he had absolutely no leverage left. "I understand," Graham finally whispered, his voice cracking. 9 o'clock. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the bed. I turned my attention back to my laptop screen one last time. I opened the high-definition video file that Mara Ellison had inadvertently secured for me the night before. I hit play. I watched the silent, recorded footage of Vivian Kincaid approaching the table. I watched her perfectly styled hair shift as she leaned down. I watched her manicured hand reach out, snatch my heavy cardstock name tent, and forcefully slam it face down onto the white linen. Sitting alone in the quiet hotel room, I finally understood the most bitter, cynical truth of the entire ordeal. People like Vivian and Graham never believe they are exposing their true, ugly nature to the world. They operate with reckless impunity because they have spent decades surrounded by cowards. They had grown entirely accustomed to a reality where no one ever possessed the power, or the absolute, unyielding nerve, to look them in the eye and call their behavior exactly what it was, until last night. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, the heavy soundproof doors of the executive suite on the top floor of the hotel clicked shut, sealing us inside a sterile environment of polished mahogany and frosted glass. I took my seat at the absolute head of the long conference table. To my immediate right, a high-definition monitor displayed the unsmiling face of Russell Dane, observing the proceedings silently from his office in Manhattan via a secure, encrypted connection. Across the wide expanse of the table sat the leadership of Peregrine Volt Systems. Graham Kincaid sat rigidly in the center, flanked by his chief financial officer, Dean Holloway, and his general counsel, Mara Ellison. There was a glaring, highly intentional absence in the room. Vivian Kincaid had not been invited. We did not request her presence, and we explicitly barred her from the premises for the duration of the negotiation. That omission hung heavily in the chilled air of the boardroom. It was a silent, profound humiliation that effectively stripped away her imagined corporate royalty. Without the protective bubble of her husband's staff and the glittering backdrop of a ballroom, she was entirely irrelevant to the actual mechanisms of power. In the corner of the room, a certified legal stenographer sat with her hands hovering perfectly still over her machine, ready to capture every single syllable spoken. Graham cleared his throat, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. He had clearly spent the brutal hours since dawn rehearsing this exact monologue with high-priced crisis management consultants. "Addison, Russell," Graham began, his tone a masterclass in calibrated, expensive contrition. He leaned forward, attempting to project an aura of reasonable transparency. "I want to open this dialogue by directly addressing the unfortunate optical incident that occurred yesterday evening. It was an unacceptable lapse in our standard hospitality protocols, and I offer you my most sincere apologies." He did not use the word assault. He did not use the word humiliation. He specifically chose the phrase optical incident. It was a calculated attempt to frame the disaster as a mere misunderstanding of visual context, rather than a fundamental breach of ethics. I did not nod. I did not offer a polite smile of acceptance. I simply stared at him, my expression entirely blank, letting the silence stretch out and force him to keep talking. Graham quickly filled the void, launching into a deeply rehearsed speech. For 5 uninterrupted minutes, he painted a grand, sweeping picture of the immense pressures surrounding this $2.9 billion merger. He spoke passionately about the relentless media scrutiny, the thousands of dedicated employees relying on this capital injection, and the critical importance of their technology to the national infrastructure grid. He was desperately trying to bury a lethal governance crisis beneath a heavy mountain of corporate nobility and shared economic goals. When he finally ran out of breath and stopped speaking, the room fell into a suffocating quiet. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic tapping of the stenographer typing out his excuses. I waited another 10 seconds before responding. I kept my voice perfectly level, devoid of any warmth or anger. "Graham, I deeply appreciate your dedication to the broader macroeconomic impact of your firm," I said, leaning back slightly in my leather chair. However, Ashcroft Meridian is not here today to debate the future of global infrastructure. I have one single, foundational question that requires a direct answer. Who truly had the authority to control that room last night? Dean Holloway jumped in immediately, eager to execute their secondary defense strategy. The financial officer's face was flushed, and he spoke too quickly. It was a catastrophic logistical cascade failure, Ms. Bishop, Dean argued, gesturing nervously with his hands. Our external event coordination vendor received conflicting, outdated floor plans. Mrs. Kincaid simply reacted poorly to what she genuinely believed was a massive seating error by the hotel staff. It was a tragic breakdown in vendor communication. It was absolutely nothing more than that. I reached into my leather portfolio resting on the table. I slowly extracted a single, printed sheet of paper and slid it precisely across the smooth glass surface toward their side of the table. It was a hard copy of the encrypted text logs my forensic team had fully authenticated just hours prior. That is a fascinating narrative, Dean, I replied, watching the color drain from his face as he looked down at the document. Because this specific transcript is a direct communication log between your chief of corporate security and the private Kincaid family office. It clearly demonstrates that the directive to aggressively alter the guest list and the explicit order to physically remove me from the premises bypassed your external vendor entirely. The command originated directly from Vivian's personal staff. She did not react to a mistake. She engineered the environment. Mara Ellison stared at the piece of paper as if it were coated in poison. As the general counsel, she was now completely trapped in a legal nightmare. She realized in that exact moment that she could no longer aggressively defend the corporation while simultaneously pretending this shadow governance model had not existed for years. Her eyes flicked sharply toward Graham, delivering a silent, desperate warning that their carefully constructed firewall had just collapsed into dust. Graham swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw ticking. His rehearsed, executive polish was rapidly fracturing under the pressure. He abruptly pivoted to his final contingency plan, attempting to buy his way out of the corner. We are fully prepared to offer you a comprehensive confidence restoration package, Graham stated, his voice tight. Effective immediately. I will personally terminate the head of corporate security. We will completely restructure our internal event management protocols to ensure strict, walled-off corporate oversight. We will mandate aggressive quarterly audits of all public-facing engagements, and those audits will report directly to an independent board committee. And, of course, I will secure a private, legally binding written apology from my wife. It was a desperate, transparent attempt to patch a gaping hole in a ship's hull with a piece of tape. You are offering to change the locks on the doors after the house has already burned to the ground, I said, my words slicing through the air like a scalpel. Firing a loyal security guard who was simply following an established chain of command and writing a new protocol manual is a cosmetic, surface-level correction. It does absolutely nothing to address the core pathology of this executive suite. Graham slammed his hand flat against the mahogany table. It was a sudden, jarring loss of emotional control that echoed sharply in the confined space. She holds absolutely no official power, Graham snapped, his voice rising in anger and sheer desperation. The air in the room instantly turned to ice. Mara Ellison visibly flinched. The seasoned attorney shot her chief executive officer a look of pure, unadulterated terror. Because as a legal professional, she understood the catastrophic, unforced error he had just committed on the official record. Graham had just loudly stated an absolute, verifiable falsehood in front of a major institutional investor and a certified court reporter. It was a statement that directly contradicted the mountain of internal communications, invoices, and security logs they both knew currently resided on their own corporate servers. He had just lied to save his pride. I held Mara's panicked gaze for a long, heavy moment before turning my attention back to the man sitting in the center of the table. I let the silence stretch until Graham realized the magnitude of the mistake he had just made. "I am not pulling the capital commitment today," I finally stated. The collective, ragged exhale from the three executives across the table was audible. For a fraction of a second, relief washed over their faces. "But," I continued, instantly crushing their momentary salvation, "I am definitively suspending the initial disbursement. Not one single dollar moves from our accounts to yours. Before I make my final, irreversible recommendation to the investment committee in New York, I require a total, unfiltered data production. I want every single internal record related to event directives over the past 36 months. I want the complete, unredacted network access logs for all family members of the executive suite. And I want a comprehensive, audited list of any corporate decision that bears the digital footprint of an individual operating entirely outside the official organizational chart." The meeting concluded without handshakes. We did not exchange pleasantries. No one had won the morning. Graham stood up slowly and buttoned his expensive suit jacket. His face was pale and drawn, but behind his exhausted eyes, I could see a fragile, pathetic sliver of hope, because I had not killed the deal right there in the room. He still believed he had time to maneuver. He believed he could return to his office, sanitize the internal records, intimidate the staff, and somehow survive the impending audit. I remained seated and watched him walk out through the heavy wooden doors, followed closely by his terrified executives. I felt no satisfaction, only cold certainty. I knew that his desperate, consuming need to maintain absolute control over his crumbling empire was precisely the weapon I needed. His lingering hope was going to be the exact thing that caused them to make their final, fatal mistake. By early afternoon, the digital grid of the Peregrine Volt emergency board meeting had devolved into an absolute bloodbath. I was not in that room, nor was I dialed into the secure server, but I did not need to be. The mechanics of corporate panic are universally predictable. Once the protective illusion of control shatters, the executives stop defending the company and start defending themselves. They were no longer arguing about the severity of the crisis. That debate had died the moment I suspended the initial capital disbursement. The only topic remaining on the virtual table was deciding exactly whose career had to be publicly sacrificed to keep the merger alive. One faction, comprised of the older, institutional directors, demanded an immediate surgical amputation. They wanted a formal, legally binding resolution completely banning Vivian from stepping foot on company property or attending any sponsored corporate function for the rest of her natural life. They argued it was the only way to demonstrate to Ashcroft Meridian that the board still possessed a spine. The opposing faction, terrified of the massive block of voting shares controlled by the Kincaid Family Trust, vehemently pushed back. They warned that moving aggressively against the spouse would trigger a scorched earth retaliation from the chief executive officer, fracturing the entire shareholder foundation and sending the stock price into a catastrophic, irreversible freefall. While the board tore at each other through their webcams, General Counsel Mara Ellison was locked inside her office, quietly pulling apart the financial architecture of the Gala to fulfill my aggressive data demands. She was hunting for a clean, defensible paper trail. Instead, she struck a deeply toxic nerve. Through the preliminary document production exchanged between our legal teams, the true horror of their operational structure finally came into sharp focus. Mara discovered a series of heavily disguised wire transfers originating not from the corporate treasury, but directly from the private Kincaid family office. These payments were being routed to a boutique, unlisted agency officially categorized as a guest experience consultancy. It was a brilliantly deceptive title for a shadow operation. This private consultancy group, entirely funded by the executive family and completely hidden from the board of directors, possessed absolute, unchecked administrative access to the company database. They were the invisible hands altering the seating charts. They were the ones controlling the physical access list to the chief executive officer. Worst of all, they were actively filtering the institutional investors. deciding who was allowed into the inner circle based entirely on Vivian's personal, unregulated biases. The legal implications were staggering. It meant the entire system of shareholder relations and partner contact had been secretly privatized by the ruling family. They were using public company resources to build a private fiefdom. For an institutional investment fund like Ashcroft Meridian, which bases its entire risk model on absolute corporate transparency. This revelation was nuclear. I did not give them time to formulate a defense. Working in tandem with Russell Dane in New York, I drafted the ultimate legal trap and transmitted it directly to Graham's inbox. We demanded a formal, sworn letter of certification. The language of the document was brutal, airtight, and entirely uncompromising. It required Graham Kincaid, acting in his official capacity as the chief executive officer, to legally certify under penalty of fraud that absolutely no individual outside the official corporate structure had exerted any influence over the investor access protocols, the strategic negotiations, or the security directives at the Gala. It was a perfectly constructed binary dilemma. If Graham signed his name to that letter, he would be establishing a direct, legally binding contradiction to the authenticated network logs and the anonymous financial data we already possessed. He would be committing undeniable securities fraud to save his pride. But if he hesitated, if he refused to put his pen to the paper, it would serve as a total, voluntary confession that he had completely lost control of his own corporation. He was cornered, with no viable exit strategy that left him intact. The pressure inside their building reached a critical mass when Elliot Voss abruptly interrupted the ongoing board meeting. The head of investor relations looked as though he had not slept in a week. His voice echoed through the conference speakers, delivering a piece of intelligence that instantly silenced the warring directors. Two of the largest secondary auxiliary funds, the institutions positioned to provide the mezzanine financing to bridge the final gaps of the acquisition, had just officially frozen their internal compliance reviews. They had caught the scent of the blood in the water. They informed Elliot that they were halting all forward momentum, indefinitely, until Ashcroft Meridian issued a final, public ruling on the $2.9 billion commitment. The gravity of the situation finally settled over the board like a lead weight. Our massive capital injection was no longer just a source of funding. It had transformed into the singular vital signal of survival for their entire financial ecosystem. If I withdrew the anchor, the entire fleet would scatter, and the company would be left to drown in its own debt. Sitting alone in my hotel suite, staring at the flashing cursor on my laptop screen, the broader picture finally locked into place. The confrontation over the VIP chair had never been the primary disease threatening this merger. It was merely the first undeniable, public symptom. It was the crucial stress test that forced a deeply rotten structure to bear weight it could no longer support. The Gala was just the spark. The profound lack of ethical boundaries had provided the ocean of gasoline. Back in the Peregrine Volt boardroom, the silence stretching across the video conference was absolute. Graham Kincaid sat at the head of his massive, empty physical table, staring intently at the grid of faces on the large monitor mounted to the wall. He waited for one of his loyalists to speak up, to offer a clever legal maneuver, to suggest a back-channel negotiation tactic. He waited for someone to assure him that his authority was still absolute. No one spoke. Graham watched closely as, one by one, the highly paid members of his board of directors subtly shifted their gaze. They looked down at their desks. They looked at their phones. They stared blankly at their own keyboards. None of them would meet his eyes through the camera lenses. In that suffocating, heavy silence, the devastating reality finally crashed down upon him. For the first time in over a decade of unchecked, arrogant rule, he no longer controlled the narrative of his own life. The empire was slipping through his fingers, and he was entirely powerless to stop it. The air inside the corporate ecosystem of Peregrine Volt systems had grown toxic, thick with the desperate, suffocating stench of self-preservation. Knowing that Ashcroft Meridian was rapidly leaning toward a total withdrawal of the capital commitment, the board members fiercely loyal to Graham Kincaid launched a covert, highly coordinated counteroffensive. They realized they could not erase the video footage, but they believed they could still manipulate the context. They began aggressively constructing a parallel reality. The strategy was classic corporate warfare. The whispers started bleeding out through industry back channels and carefully placed off the record conversations with financial journalists. The new narrative they were spinning was insidious. They were attempting to reframe the entire catastrophe by painting me as the aggressor. In their newly fabricated version of events, Addison Bishop was not a silent victim of an arrogant executive spouse. Instead, I was depicted as a deeply difficult, confrontational individual who possessed a fundamentally disruptive attitude. According to this revised history, the security chief and the event staff were simply overreacting to my hostility in a frantic attempt to maintain order at a high-stakes gathering. They were trying to turn a structural governance failure into a petty personality clash. Before noon, the depth of their moral bankruptcy was fully exposed. A notification flashed on my screen, signaling another encrypted transmission from the anonymous source inside their network. I opened the file. It was a drafted, heavily edited version of an internal corporate memorandum, scheduled to be distributed to their entire global workforce by the end of the business day. I read the polished paragraphs, my jaw tightening with absolute disgust. The memorandum was a masterpiece of cowardly misdirection. The executive leadership intended to publicly absolve Vivian Kincaid by pushing the entire weight of the scandal onto the shoulders of a 24-year-old seating arrangement manager. This junior employee, an entry-level coordinator who did not even have the clearance to be present on the ballroom floor when Vivian issued her illegal commands, was being positioned as the sole architect of the disaster. The draft claimed this young woman had grossly mismanaged the VIP routing codes and subsequently provided incorrect, highly stressful information to the chief executive officer's wife, thereby triggering the unfortunate optical incident. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the glowing monitor. They had learned absolutely nothing. Faced with the imminent destruction of a $2.9 billion merger, their instinct was not to repair the shattered foundation of their leadership. Their immediate, unfiltered instinct was to find a weaker, poorer, entirely defenseless person to crush beneath the rubble of their own mistakes. It was the exact same pathology Vivian had displayed at the banquet table. Scaled up to a corporate level, they were addicted to punching down. In New York, Russell Dane was actively preparing the final decisive meeting of the Ashcroft Meridian Investment Committee. As the lead director on the portfolio, the burden of the ultimate recommendation rested entirely on my shoulders. "We have 3 distinct pathways. Addison," Russell stated, his voice emanating crisply from the speakers of my laptop during our midday briefing. "We can hold our position and weather the public relations storm. We can initiate a strategic, 90-day delay to legally force a complete restructuring of their board and executive staff. Or we can execute a total termination of the contract based on the material breach of governance. The committee requires your formal as documented recommendation before the markets close today." "I will have my final directive ready for the committee within 3 hours," I replied, my voice devoid of any hesitation. Exactly 2 hours before my deadline, the final piece of the trap snapped into place. A secure email arrived from Graham Kincaid's legal department, containing the formal letter of certification I had demanded during our icy morning negotiation. I opened the digital document, analyzing every single syllable. Graham had actually signed it. His sweeping, arrogant signature sat at the bottom of the page, authenticated by a digital corporate seal. I read the text carefully. It was perfectly drafted, scrubbed entirely clean by a small army of desperate attorneys. It was too absolute. The language was aggressively definitive, designed to completely overwrite the reality of the footage and the leaked invoices. Graham explicitly certified, under the severe legal penalties of corporate fraud, that absolutely no individual outside the formalized corporate structure possessed any access, influence, or authority over the internal coordination systems, the investor relations protocols, or the security directives of Peregrine Vault Systems. It was a blatant lie set down in writing. I immediately routed the signed certification to the head of our legal compliance division in Manhattan. I gave him a single, highly specific directive. Cross-reference the absolute claims in this signed document against the raw digital access logs we seized from their servers this morning, I ordered. I sat in the quiet isolation of my borrowed glass office, watching the traffic flow along the sun-baked concrete of the Dallas highway below, waiting for the forensic strike. It took Ashcroft's legal team exactly 45 minutes to find the fatal, undeniable fracture. Russell Dane initiated an emergency video link. He did not bother with a greeting. "We have the decisive evidence." "Addison," Russell said, his eyes hard and cold. "Our technicians ran the network access logs against the parameters of Graham's signed certification. We isolated a highly specific digital footprint. The private, off-the-books administrative assistant employed exclusively by Vivian Kincaid actively logged into the primary guest coordination system no less than 14 times during the week leading up to the gala. Furthermore, that specific account utilized an executive override code to manually alter the seating chart for table number 4. The trap had closed with brutal mechanical perfection. This was the binary nightmare that Graham Kincaid could not escape. It was the ultimate, inescapable paradox of his arrogant leadership. If Graham signed that official certification fully knowing that his wife's private staff possessed backdoor administrative privileges to the corporate database, he had just committed documented, prosecutable securities fraud in an attempt to secure a $2.9 billion the deal. Conversely, if he signed that document completely blind to the fact that his network had been compromised by his own family, it proved he was merely a hollow figurehead. It proved he was presiding over a massive, critical infrastructure company where the internal controls were routinely manipulated without his knowledge or consent. Both realities were equally fatal. A liar cannot be trusted with our capital, and a fool cannot be trusted to protect it. The trust was not just broken, it was entirely vaporized. I drafted a brief, meticulously worded email to Mara Ellison, copying Graham Kincaid and Dean Holloway. I requested a final, comprehensive conference call to commence at the very end of the business day. I mandated that the entire active board of directors, their legal counsel, and the executive suite be present on the line. I explicitly chose not to reveal the catastrophic evidence we had just uncovered. I kept the tone of my message strictly procedural, dry, and distinctly non-threatening. I needed the executives of Peregrine Volt to walk into that virtual room believing their fabricated certification letter had successfully pacified the threat. I wanted them to feel the false, intoxicating warmth of survival. I wanted them to genuinely believe they had successfully lied their way out of the abyss. Right up until the exact second I severed the cord, the sun began its slow descent over the Dallas skyline, bleeding a bruised, violent orange across the horizon. The glass walls of my office grew cold as the shadows lengthened over the tangled ribbons of the highway below. I stood by the window, entirely alone in the quiet space. I rested my right hand flat against the heavy, leather-bound dossier resting on the credenza. The thick stack of paper contained the undeniable, irrefutable proof of an empire's demise. All the residual anger from the previous night had completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a cold, clinical certainty. As I watched the endless stream of headlights cutting through the gathering twilight, I fully understood the gravity of the execution I was about to perform. The decision waiting in the next room was no longer about seeking personal revenge for a stolen seat. It was never truly about the chair. It was about standing as the final, immovable barrier against a corporation that had grown entirely accustomed to operating with absolute, unchecked impunity. It was about stopping a machine that believed the rules did not apply to them, and it was time to tear the machine apart. At exactly 5 o'clock in the evening, the secure digital conference room flickered to life. The high-definition grid populated across my monitor, displaying the faces of the most powerful people within Peregrine Volt Systems. Alongside the legal and executive architecture of Ashcroft Meridian, This was the final arena. I sat completely still in my glass-walled office, flanked digitally by Russell Dane and our senior legal compliance team from New York. On the opposing side of the connection, Graham Kincaid sat at the head of his physical boardroom table. To his right sat his general counsel, Mara Ellison, and his chief financial officer, Dean Holloway. Arrayed around them in smaller digital squares were the 12 active members of his board of directors. The atmosphere transmitting through the audio feed was incredibly brittle, vibrating with an unspoken collective terror. Graham took a deep breath, attempting to project the commanding presence of a man who still possessed leverage. His face was pale, his eyes slightly hollowed out from a sleepless night of frantic, back-channel maneuvering. "I want to thank everyone for assembling on such short notice," Graham began, his voice a masterclass in forced, synthetic calm. He looked directly into his camera, attempting to establish dominance over the virtual room. "Over the past 24 hours, our executive team has taken decisive, comprehensive action to address the highly regrettable social misunderstanding that occurred last night. We have entirely restructured our event protocols and isolated the operational failures. I am fully confident that we have sanitized the issue, and I look forward to Ashcroft Meridian continuing this partnership with us in the spirit of not allowing a minor interpersonal friction to destroy a grandiose shared vision for our infrastructure." He finished his opening statement and muted his microphone. He sat back, waiting for me to accept his fabricated olive branch. I did not immediately respond. I let his hollow words hang in the dead air for a long, agonizing moment. I looked at the grid of faces, watching the board members shift uncomfortably under the silence. When I finally spoke, my voice was entirely devoid of emotion. It was the clinical tone of an auditor reading a final verdict. "Graham," I stated, leaning forward slightly so my face filled their primary monitor, "we are not here to discuss a social misunderstanding. We are here to discuss a systemic, fatal breach of governance. I am going to present 3 layers of established evidence to this committee. I suggest you listen very carefully, because each layer is significantly heavier than the last." Graham's forced smile instantly evaporated. "Layer 1, I continued, seamlessly sharing a frozen frame of the high-definition Gala footage to the main screen. "This visual record definitively proves that Vivian Kincaid issued direct forceful operational commands to your chief of security, and your corporate infrastructure complied without hesitation. It was not a lapse in hospitality. It was a demonstration of an active, extrajudicial chain of command." I did not wait for them to mount a defense. I immediately pushed the second exhibit to their screens. "Layer 2, I said, displaying the authenticated internal logs, venue invoices, and encrypted messages. These internal records, fully authenticated by our digital forensics division this morning, confirm that last night was not an isolated emotional outburst. This documentation proves a multi-year pattern wherein the Kincaid family office has consistently overridden official corporate protocols, manipulated strategic investor access, and utilized company resources to enforce personal biases. You have been operating a shadow governance model directly under the noses of your board of directors." A sharp collective intake of breath echoed through the audio feed from several of the board members. They were staring at the irrefutable proof of their own blindness, but I was not finished. "And finally, layer 3, I concluded, pulling up the pristine, digitally signed letter Graham had sent me just hours prior. I placed it side by side with the raw network access logs we had cross-referenced. This morning, Graham Kincaid legally certified, under penalty of fraud, that absolutely no individual outside the formal corporate structure possessed any access to your coordination systems. However, these corresponding digital footprints prove that private staff entirely unaffiliated with Peregrine Volt utilized executive override codes to alter the master database 14 times this week alone." In the lower right quadrant of my screen, Mara Ellison stopped moving entirely. The general counsel stared at the damning contradiction displayed before her. She did not argue. She did not attempt to interject with a legal technicality. She simply closed her eyes for a single, heavy second. Exactly like someone who had just heard the heavy steel tumblers of a final lock snap shut. She knew the game was completely over. Panic finally breached Graham's carefully constructed dam. His eyes widened, darting between the irrefutable evidence on the screen and the horrified faces of his directors. He scrambled forward, his chest hitting the edge of the boardroom table, desperately pivoting toward raw negotiation. "Addison, listen to me," Graham pleaded, his voice rising in pitch, completely abandoning his executive composure. "We can fix this right now. We can execute immediate, sweeping personnel changes. I will personally authorize a fully independent, third-party investigation into every single one of those logs. We can even agree to legally delay the closing of the acquisition by 90 days to allow Ashcroft to completely sanitize our entire internal process. Just tell me what you need to see." "I do not need to see anything else," I replied, my voice slicing through his frantic bargaining with absolute, freezing finality. "We invest in structure. Your structure has already answered for you." I held his desperate gaze through the camera lens, refusing to let him look away from the execution. "The fundamental issue here is no longer contained to an ugly incident at a gala," I explained, shifting my focus to address the entire board. "The risk has escalated exponentially. The chief executive officer just transmitted a signed, legally binding confirmation to a major institutional investor that directly contradicts the verifiable data living on his own servers. That is a material misrepresentation of corporate stability." I paused, letting the devastating weight of those words settle over the room, before delivering the final strike. "Therefore, acting under the explicit authority of the Executive Conduct and Influence Trigger, and invoking the clause regarding the absolute material accuracy of foundational statements, Ashcroft Meridian Partners officially terminates the entire $2.9 billion capital commitment. This termination is absolute, non-negotiable, and effective immediately." The ensuing silence was absolute zero. It was a cold so profound it felt as though the digital connection itself had frozen over. Dean Holloway's face turned the color of wet ash. The chief financial officer understood the catastrophic math instantly. Without our anchor capital, the secondary syndicate banks would immediately trigger their own withdrawal clauses. The entire financial architecture of their company was about to implode before the sun rose tomorrow. Suddenly, the audio feed erupted into pure chaos. Several board members began shouting over each other, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of terror, furious accusations, and desperate demands for legal counsel. But in the center of the storm, Graham Kincaid remained entirely silent. He sat paralyzed in his leather chair, his mouth slightly open, staring blankly at the monitor. He could not form a single syllable because he finally understood that there was no speech, no manipulation, and no amount of arrogant posturing that could possibly bridge the massive, multi-billion-dollar crater that had just opened up beneath his feet. I reached forward and severed the connection. The screen went instantly black. By the time the markets opened the following morning, the news had already spread across the global financial wires. The language used by the press was incredibly dry, sterile, and heavily sanitized. The headlines simply stated that a major institutional investor had unexpectedly withdrawn from a massive acquisition due to undisclosed governance concerns. Not a single financial bulletin mentioned the charity gala. No reporter wrote a single word about a missing name card or a spilled glass of champagne. But within the quiet, ruthless corridors of high finance, absolutely everyone knew the truth. They knew that a single VIP chair had successfully exposed an entire corporate empire that was fundamentally designed to operate on nothing but unchecked arrogance. I left the glass office very late that evening. The floor was completely empty, the lights dimmed to a low, conservative hum. I did not pour a glass of celebratory scotch. I did not feel the need to call anyone to gloat. I simply packed my laptop into my leather bag, turned my back to the Dallas skyline, and walked out to the elevators without ever looking back at the monitors. Because the truest lesson of this industry is that a monumental deal does not actually die at the exact moment the money is legally pulled away. The deal dies the very second that powerful people genuinely believe they possess the right to publicly humiliate a complete stranger, and then still have the audacity to demand that the market blindly trust their capacity for self-control. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know where you are tuning in from in the comments below, so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us by hitting the hype button so this story can reach even more people.